What you are about to hear has never appeared in a school textbook. It has never been the subject of a congressional apology. It has never been taught to the children of the people it killed. And every word of it is documented. By Christmas Eve, 1926, 41 people were dying in a single New York hospital, and nobody in government was surprised. To understand what happened, you have to understand what Prohibition actually was. Not the speakeasies, not the jazz, not the romanticized version that history gave it. Prohibition was a war. And like every war, it had casualties the people in charge decided were acceptable. January 1920. The 18th Amendment takes effect. The manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol is now illegal across the United States. What the government hadn't anticipated was how little people cared. Bootleggers didn't disappear. They adapted. Industrial alcohol, the kind used in factories and paint thinner and cleaning agents, was everywhere. And chemists working for organized crime had figured out how to strip the poison from it, redistill it, and sell it as drinking alcohol. The government knew this was happening. And in 1926, a group of federal officials made a decision that would not be publicized, would not be debated, and would not, for decades, be properly accounted for. They ordered the poison levels increased. The technical name for what they did is denaturing. Industrial alcohol had always been required by law to contain some level of toxic additive to discourage drinking. The standard formula included small amounts of methanol. Methanol is not a gentle poison. It causes blindness. It causes organ failure. It causes death. But the 1926 formula was different. Federal chemists were instructed to push the methanol concentration to 10%. They added chloroform. They added acetone. They added kerosene. These were not accidental contaminants. They were a deliberate recipe, designed by government scientists, approved by government officials, and distributed through the industrial supply chain that bootleggers were tapping. The logic, if you can call it that, was simple. If people kept drinking in spite of prohibition, then the alcohol they drank should kill them. The deaths would serve as a deterrent. The suffering would be the message. They were not wrong that people would die. They were simply indifferent to it. By December 1926, the bodies had started arriving. On Christmas Eve, Bellevue Hospital in New York admitted 41 people in a single night. 8 were dead before morning. Over the following days, the numbers kept climbing. People who had done nothing more than attend a holiday party, share a drink with neighbors, or buy a bottle from the wrong man on the wrong corner. The symptoms were unmistakable to the doctors. This was methanol poisoning. Systematic, widespread. Not an accident. Charles Norris, New York City's chief medical examiner, went public. He told reporters exactly what was happening. He named the source. He named the government. The New York Times published his findings. The response from Washington was not a denial. It was not an investigation. It was a press release confirming that yes, the formula had been strengthened, and that yes, this would continue. One headline at the time read, "Government to double alcohol poison content." It was printed without outrage, not as a scandal, as a policy update. The man most responsible for the pressure to maintain and intensify the poisoning program was not a chemist. He was a lobbyist. Wayne Wheeler ran the Anti-Saloon League, the most powerful single-issue lobbying organization in American history. Wheeler had spent decades engineering prohibition into law. He had more influence over Congress than most senators, and he was not prepared to let bootleggers undo his life's work. When the deaths began to mount, when Norris and others demanded the government stop, Wheeler's response was recorded and preserved. He said the victims were, in his words, deliberate suicides. He said that to root out a bad habit cost many lives. He was not removed from his position. He was not investigated. The program continued. The Anti-Saloon League also lobbied, successfully, to have the poison warning labels removed from industrial alcohol containers, so that people who bought the redistilled product would have no way of knowing what was in it. They removed the warnings. Prohibition ended in December 1933. The poisoning program ended with it. The final death toll from the federal poisoning program is estimated at between 10 and 15,000 people. That estimate comes from medical records, death certificates, and hospital admissions filed during the period. The true number is likely higher. Many deaths in rural areas were never properly recorded. No government official was ever charged. No investigation was opened. Wayne Wheeler died in 1927 of natural causes, before the full scale of the program was known to the public. He was given a respectful obituary. The federal poisoning of American citizens during Prohibition is not classified. It is not disputed. It is documented in government records, in contemporary newspaper accounts, in medical examiner reports that have been publicly available for nearly a century. It is simply not taught. Not taught in schools. Not included in the standard Prohibition narrative of speakeasies and jazz and Al Capone. Not mentioned when the word prohibition comes up in conversation. The men who ordered it died in their beds. The documents are in the archive, and the 10,000 people who died because their government decided they were acceptable losses, they remain in most accounts of this period invisible. This was condemned. The sources for everything you just heard are documented and listed below this video. If you want to know what else has been buried, subscribe. To understand how this program was allowed to exist, you have to understand the political machinery that built Prohibition in the first place. The 18th Amendment didn't appear from nowhere. It was a result of 30 years of organized, disciplined, strategically brilliant campaigning by a movement that understood power better than most politicians of the era. The temperance movement in America had roots going back to the 1820s. But it didn't become politically unstoppable until it found an organizational vehicle. And that vehicle was the Anti-Saloon League, founded in 1893. The League's genius was this: it didn't care about parties. It didn't endorse Democrats or Republicans. It endorsed candidates who would vote dry, regardless of everything else they believed. It turned alcohol into a single-issue litmus test, and it delivered votes with enough reliability that any politician who wanted to keep their seat had to take it seriously. By the 1910s, state after state had gone dry under League pressure. By the time Congress voted on the 18th Amendment in 1917, the political infrastructure for national prohibition had been painstakingly assembled over decades. Wayne Wheeler had done most of the assembling. Wheeler grew up in rural Ohio. As a child, he had watched a drunk farmhand swing a pitchfork and nearly kill him. The story, which he told often, is probably true. It would certainly explain the quality of his obsession. He joined the Anti-Saloon League in the 1890s and became its de facto chief strategist. He was a lawyer by training, which meant he understood legislation. He was a campaigner by instinct, which meant he understood people. And he was ruthless by temperament, which meant he didn't stop. At the height of his influence, Wheeler was writing legislation that members of Congress would introduce without changing a word. He had direct lines to the White House. He vetted cabinet appointments for their views on prohibition. One journalist at the time described him as the most powerful man in America who didn't hold elected office. He was not exaggerating. When the 18th Amendment passed, Wheeler didn't celebrate and retire. He shifted his focus to enforcement. The Volstead Act, the legislation that gave the amendment its teeth, was largely his work. And when enforcement started failing, his response was to push for escalation at every level. The poisoning program was, in a meaningful sense, Wheeler's program. He may not have designed the specific chemical formulas, but he provided the ideological pressure, the political cover, and the moral framework that made it possible. His framework was simple. Drinkers had chosen to break the law. Whatever happened to them as a consequence of that choice was their own fault. The government had no obligation to make illegal activities safe. Read that slowly. The government had no obligation to make illegal activity safe. That logic, followed to its end, justifies poisoning people. To understand why the 1926 formula was so lethal, you need to understand what methanol actually does to the human body. Methanol, wood alcohol, looks identical to ethanol, the alcohol in drinks. It is colorless. It has almost no distinctive smell. In the early stages of consumption, it produces intoxication that is indistinguishable from ordinary drunkenness. This is what makes it so dangerous. The difference doesn't become apparent until the body begins to metabolize it. Where ethanol breaks down into relatively harmless byproducts, methanol breaks down into formaldehyde, and then into formic acid. Both are toxic. Formic acid in particular disrupts the cell's ability to use oxygen. It essentially starves cells of energy at the metabolic level. The optic nerve is especially vulnerable. Which is why the first distinctive symptom of methanol poisoning, after the initial drunk period, is visual disturbance. People describe it as looking through a snowstorm. Then the vision dims. Then, in severe cases, it goes entirely. Many of the people who survived the Christmas Eve poisonings were permanently blind. Beyond the eyes. As the formic acid builds in the blood, it causes metabolic acidosis. The blood becomes too acidic to sustain normal function. The kidneys begin to fail. The liver follows. Breathing becomes labored as the body tries to compensate. Without medical intervention, the result is coma and death. The government's chemists knew all of this. Methanol toxicity was well understood by 1926. There was no ambiguity about what 10% methanol in a widely consumed product would do to human beings. They knew. They proceeded. The death toll statistics, 10 to 15,000, are abstract in the way that large numbers always are. It is worth trying to make them less so. The people who died from the federal poisoning program were disproportionately poor. They were the people who couldn't afford the higher quality bootleg liquor that wealthy drinkers had access to. The good stuff that had been more carefully redistilled, that had better odds of being clean. The people dying in Bellevue on Christmas Eve were working-class New Yorkers who had bought cheap liquor from street-level dealers. They were also disproportionately recent immigrants. In the tenement neighborhoods of New York and Chicago and other major cities, communal drinking was a cultural practice, a social ritual imported from Europe, where alcohol consumption had never carried the same moral weight it did in Protestant American culture. These communities had not voted for prohibition. They had not been consulted, and they bore a disproportionate share of its costs. There were also the people in rural areas whose deaths were never properly recorded. A man found dead in a farmhouse. A woman who collapsed after a family gathering. In 1926 and 1927, without toxicology as a standard part of every autopsy, many of these deaths were attributed to heart failure, to respiratory illness, to causes that left the ledger clean. The true number, we will never know. What we know is that the people at the bottom of every social hierarchy, the people with the least money, the least political power, the least access to information and alternatives, died at the highest rates, as they always do. Charles Norris deserves more than a footnote. He had been appointed New York City's first chief medical examiner in 1918, a role created specifically to replace the old coroner system, which had been riddled with political patronage and incompetence. Norris was a scientist, trained in pathology in New York and Europe, and he took the job with the explicit intention of making it independent of political pressure. That independence was exactly what allowed him to do what he did in December 1926. When the poisoning cases started arriving at Bellevue and the city's other hospitals, Norris mobilized his office. His chief toxicologist, Alexander Gettler, one of the founders of forensic toxicology as a discipline, ran the chemical analyses. The results were unambiguous. The deaths were caused by methanol. The methanol had come from denatured industrial alcohol. The denaturation formula had been mandated by the federal government. Norris knew what going public would mean. He would be accusing the United States government of killing its own citizens. He would be challenging the most powerful lobbying organization in the country. He would be doing this during a period when prohibition had enormous popular and political support. He did it anyway. His statement to the press was precise, documented, and damning. He didn't speculate. He reported what the evidence showed. He called what the government was doing what it was, a poisoning program. Washington's response, the press release confirming the program would continue, did not silence him. He kept speaking. He kept publishing findings. He continued to advocate for the program to end until it did. He received no formal recognition for it. He is not in the history books most people read. When Prohibition was repealed in December 1933, the country moved on with remarkable speed. There was relief. There was celebration. There was, in large parts of the country, a simple desire to draw a line under the whole disastrous experiment and not look back too closely at what it had cost. Nobody demanded accountability for the poisoning program. No senators stood up and called for hearings. No journalist launched an investigation into which officials had approved which formulas in which years. No family that had lost someone to methanol poisoning in 1927 or 1928 or 1929 was ever told, officially, that their government had done it deliberately. The men who designed the program had in many cases already retired or died. The institutional memory of exactly who had made which decisions had conveniently dispersed. This is how accountability for mass state harm most often fails, not through a dramatic cover-up, but through the simple passage of time. By the time the will to ask questions existed, the people who could have answered them were gone. And by then, The country had bigger things to worry about. The Depression, then the war, then the post-war Reconstruction, the 10,000 dead from a poisoning program that had ended a decade earlier were not a political priority. They never became one. The federal poisoning of American citizens during Prohibition is not classified. It is not disputed by serious historians. It is documented in government records, in contemporary newspaper accounts, in the published findings of Charles Norris and Alexander Gettler, in reports that have been publicly available for nearly a century. It is simply not taught. Part of the reason is structural. The Prohibition story that entered American cultural memory was shaped by the entertainment industry of the 1930s and beyond. Gangster films, jazz mythology, the glamour of the speakeasy. Al Capone was a more compelling figure than a federal chemist adjusting methanol concentrations. The story of dashing lawbreakers outsmarting a puritanical government was more commercially and emotionally appealing than the story of that government poisoning poor immigrants in New York tenements. Part of the reason is political. The full account of the poisoning program is an indictment, not of a single party, not of a single administration, but of a particular kind of certainty. The certainty that says, we know what is good for people, and we are entitled to use state power to enforce it. And the people who resist are not victims, they are criminals who deserve what happens to them. That certainty did not die with Prohibition. It has reappeared in different forms across the decades since. And the story of what it produced in the 1920s is, if you are inclined toward that kind of certainty, not a story you want widely circulated. So it isn't. Not in school curricula, not in the standard Prohibition narrative of speakeasies and jazz and Al Capone. Not mentioned when the word Prohibition comes up in conversation. The men who ordered it died in their beds. The documents are in the archive, and the 10,000 people who died because their government decided they were acceptable losses, they remain in most accounts of this period invisible. This was condemned. The sources for everything you just heard are documented and listed below this video. If you want to know what else has been buried, subscribe.